Fargo, North Dakota, December 11th, 1921. Dear Edmund, you asked me, in your last letter, what was the most interesting thing I saw in 18 years of practicing medicine on the northern plains. You expected, I think, a story about surgery. Perhaps the time I removed a man's gangrenous foot by lantern light in a sod house outside Bismarck, with nothing for anesthesia but whiskey and a leather strap to bite. That is a good story. I have told it at enough dinner tables to know it lands well. But it is not the story I am going to tell you. I am going to tell you about a woman named Marta Solberg, a Norwegian widow who lived 6 miles west of a small town called Granger Flats in Dakota Territory, and about what she built into the side of a hill in the autumn of 1886 using grass and clay and a kind of patience that I have spent 30 years trying to understand. I am telling you this now because last week I read an article in a German engineering journal, your cousin Ida translated the important parts for me, describing a principle called Tot-Luftschicht, which translates, more or less, as dead air space. The article described how trapped, motionless air resists the transfer of heat, and how this principle was now being applied in modern building construction across northern Europe. The article was dated 1920. It cited research from 1908. Marta Solberg applied that principle in 1886. She had no article, she had no journal, she had her father's hands and her father's voice in her memory, and she had a hill that no one in Granger Flats had ever thought worth looking at twice. I want you to understand something before I begin. I am not writing this to make her a legend. Legends are smooth things, sanded down until nothing catches. What I remember about Marta Solberg is precisely what catches: the rough places, the long silences, the fact that she told me something in the autumn of 1886 that I listened to politely and promptly failed to act upon. People died that winter who might not have died. I have made my peace with that, after a fashion. But I have not forgotten it. And I am old enough now, Edmund, to understand that the most useful thing I can do with a regret is turn it into a lesson and hand it to someone younger. So, Granger Flats, Dakota Territory. The autumn of 1886. The town was not much to look at, and the people who lived there were the first to tell you so, with the particular pride that frontier people take in hardship, as though suffering is a form of accomplishment. 34 families, give or take the season. A general store run by a man named Jonas Ridley, who knew everything that happened within 20 miles of his front porch and charged accordingly for both goods and information. A one-room schoolhouse with walls so thin that the children sat in their coats from November through March. A church that Reverend Clarence Houck filled every Sunday with people who were, it must be said, motivated as much by the building's comparative warmth as by the state of their souls. There was no doctor when I arrived in 1883. There had been one before me, a man named Purvis, who had come west with ambitions and left 2 years later with a drinking problem and a healthier respect for what ambition costs. I was 28 years old, freshly graduated from Cincinnati, and I had told myself that the frontier was where a young physician could do real good. I was not wrong about that. I was wrong about nearly everything else. The land around Granger Flats was bunchgrass prairie, flat as a carpenter's level in every direction except one. To the west, running roughly north to south for about 3 miles, was a low ridge of packed earth and glacial gravel that the earliest settlers had named, without much imagination, the ridgeline. It rose perhaps 40 feet at its highest point. It held no timber worth cutting, no water anyone had found, and soil too compacted and stony for cultivation. Farmers used it to anchor fence lines. Children used it to slide on in winter. Everyone else ignored it entirely. I mention the ridgeline now because you will need to remember it. The winter of 1886 to 1887 is still called, in agricultural records and old newspaper archives, the Great Die-Up. Across the northern plains that season, ranchers and homesteaders lost between 60 and 90% of their livestock. The cold came in early, and it came in hard, and it did not relent. By January, the thermometer outside Jonas Ridley's store, the only one in town, had recorded temperatures below -30 on 11 separate mornings. On the worst night, the 12th of January, it read -41 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that number precisely because I wrote it in my medical journal that evening after I came inside from making my rounds, and because I have looked at that journal entry many times since. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is a habit of old men, and I am trying to resist it. In the autumn of 1886, before the cold arrived, Granger Flats was a town under a particular kind of quiet pressure. The previous 2 winters had been hard, not record-breaking, but hard enough that the memory of cold had settled into people's joints and dispositions. Cattle numbers were down. 2 families had sold their claims and left in the spring, and the empty homesteads sat at the edge of the valley like pulled teeth, present in their absence. It was in this atmosphere that most people in town thought about winter preparation the way Reverend Houck preached about it, practically and communally. Stack more wood, render more tallow, patch the gaps in the barn walls with whatever came to hand. Help your neighbor when you could and expect help in return. It was sensible. It had worked before, more or less. There was nothing wrong with this approach as far as it went. The trouble, as I came to understand it later, is that it was an approach built entirely on the assumption that what had worked before would continue to work. No one in Granger Flats that autumn was asking whether there might be a fundamentally different way to keep warm. The question did not seem worth asking because the answer seemed obvious. You burned fuel. You patched gaps. You endured. No one was asking that question except Marta Solberg. I had known Marta for 3 years by the autumn of 1886. She was 44 years old, a Norwegian woman from Minnesota who had come to Dakota with her husband Eric in 1882. Eric Solberg had been a quiet, methodical man, a good farmer, patient with machinery, slow to anger, and equally slow to celebrate. He had died in the winter of 1884 of pneumonia, which was not an unusual way to die in Dakota Territory, but was, I can tell you from having sat beside him at the end, an unusually hard way to go. He was gone in 11 days from first symptom to last breath. After Eric died, there was a general expectation in Granger Flats that Marta would sell the claim and return to Minnesota, where she had family. Her brother Halvard ran a cooperative in St. Paul and had written to offer her a place in his household. I know this because Marta told me, some years later, that she had read his letter twice, folded it carefully and placed it inside her Bible, and then gone out to the barn to check on her horse. She did not leave. She had no dramatic reason for staying, no speech she gave the town about roots and determination. She stayed because the land was paid for, and she did not have it in her to walk away from something paid for. That was how she explained it to me once, in the flat and practical way she had of explaining herself. I believed her. I had seen enough frontier women by that point to know that stubbornness and sentimentality can look identical from the outside, but feel entirely different from within. By 1886, Marta had been farming alone for 2 years. She ran a small herd, 4 cows, 2 goats, a flock of chickens that dwindled each winter and replenished each spring. She kept a kitchen garden that she tended with a precision that struck the neighboring farm wives as excessive, and that I recognized once I understood her background as something else entirely. Before she married Eric, Marta had spent 6 years in Minneapolis working in the household of an architect named Bergstrom, who designed not grand civic buildings but practical ones, grain storage facilities, winter barns, root cellars for farms across the upper Midwest. She had not been his draftsman or his apprentice in any formal sense. She had been his housekeeper. But she was a woman who watched and remembered, and Bergstrom was a man who thought out loud. And over 6 years, she had absorbed a considerable amount of practical knowledge about why some structures held heat and others shed it like water off bare stone. Her father had given her the foundation of that knowledge before Minneapolis. Lars Bakken had been a wall builder in Norway, a tradesman who constructed the thick earthen and stone walls of rural farmhouses in the cold hills outside Bergen. He was not an educated man by any formal measure, but he understood heat and cold in the way that people who work with materials for 40 years come to understand them, not as abstractions, but as physical realities with specific behaviors and specific vulnerabilities. He had told young Marta, when she was perhaps 10 years old and watching him pack dried grass between the double walls of a neighbor's barn, "Still air does not move heat. Moving air does. Keep the air still and the wall does the rest." He had said it in Norwegian, and she had translated it for me years later with the careful deliberateness of someone rendering a passage of Scripture. I wrote it in my journal that same evening. I have thought about it many times since. In Granger Flats that autumn, Marta was not unpopular exactly. She was something more complicated than unpopular. She was a woman alone, which in a frontier community of that era carried a specific social weight, not quite suspicion, not quite pity, but a kind of collective unease, as though her solitude were a problem that reflected poorly on everyone who hadn't solved it. Reverend Houck prayed for her by name during services, which she attended rarely and silently when she did. The farm wives were polite to her at the general store and privately agreed among themselves that it was a hard situation and that she seemed to be managing. What none of them knew, what I did not know until much later, was that Marta had spent the previous winter conducting a quiet experiment on the north wall of her cow barn. She had built a test section of wall, 3 feet wide, 2 feet thick, double-layered with dried prairie grass, packed between the inner and outer faces. She had monitored it through the winter of 1885 with the only instrument available to her, her hands. Every morning she pressed her palm against the inner surface and held it there for a slow count of 30. Then she pressed it against an adjacent section of single-thickness wall and counted again. She did this for 14 weeks. She did not write the results down. She kept them in the same place she kept everything that mattered, in the back of her mind, patient and waiting. She told no one. That September she came into Jonas Ridley's store and purchased 2 bolts of burlap, 40 feet of hemp rope, and 3 pounds of cut nails. She also purchased 2 pounds of coffee, a small sack of salt, and a jar of bear tallow that Ridley kept behind the counter for serious winter preparations. Ridley, who tracked every purchase in town with the attention of a man who understood that information was as valuable as inventory, noted the unusual ratio of the burlap to the foodstuffs. "What are you building, Mrs. Solberg?" he asked. "A wall," she said. Ridley relayed this exchange to at least 4 people that afternoon, with the implication that the widow Solberg was perhaps not managing quite as well as she appeared. Reverend Houck heard the story and incorporated it gently into the following Sunday's sermon on the virtue of seeking community in times of hardship rather than pursuing solitary remedies. It was the first week of October. The birds had been leaving for 3 weeks, earlier than anyone in town could remember. The cattle in the valley were putting on fat with an urgency that experienced ranchers found unsettling rather than encouraging. I was making my rounds that week. I stopped at the Toll schoolhouse and noted that the walls, when I pressed my palm flat against the interior siding, were already cold. Agnes Toll was at the chalkboard, teaching long division to 8 children in varying states of winter clothing. Her daughter Clara, 4 years old and not yet school age, sat on a blanket in the corner with a rag doll and a patience remarkable for her age. I stood in the doorway and looked at the walls and thought, this building will not be sufficient. I thought it. I wrote nothing down. I moved on to my next call. 6 miles west, at the edge of the property line nearest the ridgeline, Marta Solberg was unloading burlap from her wagon in the thin October light, with her old bay horse Cole standing patient in the traces and the first suggestion of real cold moving down from the north like something with purpose. She was not building a wall yet. She was measuring. She walked the base of the ridgeline with a length of rope knotted at 6-inch intervals, pressing her boot heel into the ground at regular intervals, reading the soil the way her father had taught her to read it, not as dirt, but as a record of everything that had happened below it. She stopped at a point roughly in the middle of the ridge's south face and crouched down. She pressed both hands flat against the earth. She stayed there for a long time. Then she stood up, coiled her rope, and walked back to where Cole was waiting. "Here," she said to no one in particular, or perhaps to the horse. Cole's ears moved, tracking her voice with the mild interest of an animal that has long since decided its person is sensible enough to follow. It was the second week of October, 1886. The worst winter in 30 years was 6 weeks away, and no one in Granger Flats was watching the ridgeline. I should tell you something about how I know what I know, Edmund, before I go much further into this. A physician who has practiced long enough in a small place accumulates a particular kind of knowledge that has no name in the medical texts. It is not clinical knowledge exactly. It is more like the knowledge a river acquires of its own banks, the result of moving through the same terrain, season after season, until you have touched every surface and remember the shape of each. You know which families eat well and which do not. You know which men will describe a pain accurately and which will diminish it out of pride and which will exaggerate it out of loneliness. You know, after enough years, when something in a household has changed, even before anyone tells you. I knew Granger Flats the way I knew my own hands by 1886. And what I knew of Marta Solberg I had assembled the way you assemble any portrait of a private person, not from what they tell you directly, but from what they let slip in the margins of other conversations, from what you observe when you arrive unexpected, from the questions they ask you that are not quite about medicine. In September of 1886, she had asked me, during a routine call I made to check a cut on her hand that had been slow to close, whether I knew anything about the thermal properties of different soils. She asked it the way she asked most things, without preamble, in the middle of doing something else, as though the question had simply risen to the surface after a long time submerged. I told her that soil thermal properties were somewhat outside my area of study, but that I believed deeper ground tended to remain at more stable temperatures year-round. I believe I used the word insulating at some point. I was pleased with myself for knowing that much. She nodded. She went back to the harness she was mending. I went back to examining her hand. It did not occur to me until many months later that she had been, in her quiet way, checking whether I knew something she did not. And that when my answer confirmed she already knew more than I did, she had filed that information away and moved on. That was Marta Solberg's way. She wasted very little. To understand what she built, you have to understand what she was thinking. And to understand what she was thinking, you have to go back further than Granger Flats. You have to go back to a hillside outside Bergen, Norway, in approximately 1852, where a girl of about 10 years old was watching her father build a wall. Lars Bakken was not a large man, by the account Marta gave me. He was compact and deliberate, with hands that were, she said, always slightly warm, even in winter, even after hours of outdoor work, as though he generated his own supply of heat and rationed it carefully. He built walls the old way, the way his own father had built them, double-faced, with an inner cavity packed with dried material, straw, when there was enough of it, dried bracken, shredded bark, dried grass from the upper meadows, cut in late summer when it held the least moisture and the most trapped air in its hollow stems. He had explained it to Marta with the patience of a craftsman who understood that the best way to pass something on was to make it feel like common sense rather than specialized knowledge. Still air does not move heat, he told her. Moving air does. A wall that holds still air between its faces holds the warmth on one side and keeps the cold on the other. The material in the middle does not matter so much as the air inside it. You are not filling the wall with grass. You are filling it with stillness. Marta had carried this for 34 years by the time she stood at the base of the ridgeline in October of 1886, with her knotted rope and her cold hands pressed into the earth. What she had added to her father's teaching over those 34 years was a layer of practical engineering that she had absorbed during her years with Bergstrom in Minneapolis. Bergstrom built cold-season structures for a living, and the problem he returned to most often, the problem he talked about over supper, that he sketched on any available paper, that he complained about with the specific frustration of a man who has almost solved something, was the problem of the North Wall. Any structure built on the northern plains faced its greatest thermal challenge on its north side, where wind arrived unobstructed from Canada and pressed against the wall with a consistency and force that no amount of patching could fully defeat. Bergstrom's solution, which he had spent years refining, was to reduce the north wall's exposure by integrating the structure into existing landforms. Build against a hillside. Use the earth itself as the north wall. Let 40 feet of compacted glacial gravel absorb the wind's force so that your timber and your insulation only had to address what came through from the sides and above. He had called it, in his precise Swedish-accented English, borrowing the hill's patience. The hill had been dealing with that wind for 10,000 years. It knew what it was doing. Marta had watched Bergstrom apply this principle to granaries and root cellars and one large winter barn outside Stillwater that she had visited twice and studied with the attention of someone who intends to use what she is seeing. She had never built anything using it herself. She had not, in the years since Minneapolis, lived anywhere that offered the right terrain, until the ridgeline. She began on the 14th of October. The first 3 days were not construction. They were reading. She walked the south face of the ridgeline each morning at the same hour, watching the frost. Where the frost clung longest to the ground, the earth below was cold and poorly drained. Where it released early, the soil held warmth from below, geothermal warmth, as I would now call it, though Marta would have called it simply the hill's own heat. She was looking for the place where the hill's heat and the hill's shelter coincided, the point on the south face where the ridge above was tallest, cutting the north wind most completely, and where the ground below released frost earliest in the morning. She found it on the third day. It was roughly in the middle of the ridge's length, perhaps 200 yards from either end. The frost there was gone by 7:30 in the morning, while 20 yards to either side it persisted until 9 or later. She drove a stake into the ground at that point with the back of her hatchet and tied a strip of red cloth to its top. On the fourth day, she began to dig. The work was harder than she had expected, and she had expected it to be hard. The ground at the base of the ridgeline was compacted gravel and clay mixed in uneven layers, and her spade rang against stone every few inches. She dug a trench first, 8 feet wide, 10 feet into the hillside, following the slope of the ground, rather than cutting against it. The idea was not to create a hole, but to create a space that the hill was already inclined to shelter. She was not imposing a structure on the land. She was following the geometry the land offered. By the end of the first week, she had moved an amount of earth that, when I estimated it later, came to somewhere between 4 and 5 tons. She had done this alone, with a spade, a pickaxe borrowed from her own fence post work, and Cole pulling a small sledge to carry the excavated material 20 yards down slope, where she was already laying the foundation of a terrace that would later serve as a windbreak for the structure's east side. She was 44 years old. She had been farming alone for 2 years. She did not, as far as I know, consider any of this remarkable. The walls came next, and here is where she made her first significant error. I want to describe this carefully, Edmund, because the error and the correction are both important, and because the story of how a good idea actually gets built is never the story of an unbroken line from conception to completion. It is always a story of collision with reality, of moments where the material refuses to behave as the mind expected, and of what the builder does in those moments. Marta built the inner wall first, a single course of the best flat stones she could lever from the ridge face. Laid with clay mortar, she mixed in a wooden trough using water hauled from the creek a quarter-mile south. The stones were not quarried. They were whatever the ridge offered, and the ridge offered a considerable variety. She sorted them by thickness, using the flattest ones at the base and accepting more irregularity as the wall rose. It was not elegant work. It was not meant to be. Then she built the outer wall, roughly parallel to the inner face, leaving a gap of 5 inches between them. And then she packed the gap with grass. The grass she used that first time was cut from the lower meadow, prairie bunch grass, which grew in dense clumps and was abundant and easy to pull. She had cut it the day before, in the late afternoon, and bundled it loosely. It was, she told me afterward, the single decision in the entire project that she should have thought about more carefully. The grass was not fully dry. It had been a damp October, and the lower meadow held moisture longer than the upland grass. She had not pressed the bundles hard enough to notice the residual dampness when she was cutting. She noticed it now inside the wall, where it was beginning, within 3 days, to mat and compress, and in the portions nearest the clay mortar, to begin the early stages of decay. Within a week, the packed section had lost perhaps a third of its volume as the grass compacted under its own weight. The still air that the packing was meant to trap had escaped through the newly opened channels. The wall was no longer dead air. It was a series of small drafts. She took it apart. She did this without, as far as I can determine, particular frustration or self-recrimination. She had built a test. The test had told her something, and now she knew something she had not known before. This is, I should point out, exactly the correct attitude with which to conduct an experiment, and it is also an attitude that is considerably easier to describe than to actually maintain when you are cold and behind schedule and have just spent a week building something you are now disassembling. She hauled the damp grass out by the armload and spread it across the flat stones of the terrace to dry. Then she went to the upland meadow, the ground above the ridge's crest, where the wind had been curing the grass since August, and she cut there instead. She pressed each bundle hard between her palms before adding it to the wall, and she rejected any handful that felt cool rather than dry against her skin. Cool grass held moisture. Dry grass was warm in the hand, almost dusty, and when you compressed it and released it, it sprang back. Her father had never told her this. She had arrived at it herself in the space of 10 days. She repacked the wall using the upland grass. This time, when she pressed her palm against the outer face and held it while she counted slowly to 30, the surface held a different quality of cold, not the biting, penetrating cold of exposed stone, but a flat, inert cold, the cold of something that was simply not warm, rather than something that was actively taking warmth away. It was a small difference. It was the difference she had been looking for. The roof gave her less trouble because she was more conservative. She set her heaviest timber across the span of the trench, a single beam of lodgepole pine she had been keeping in the barn since the previous spring, which Eric had felled and she had not yet found a use for, and laid smaller poles across it at close intervals, then layered dried grass 18 inches deep over the poles, then packed 8 inches of clay and gravel over the grass. The weight was considerable. The beam held. When she was finished with the exterior, she stood back and looked at what she had built. It did not look like much. The south face presented a low wall of irregular stone with a single timber-framed opening for a door and one small window set deep in the sill to keep out the wind's lateral pressure. The roofline was barely visible above the level of the surrounding ground. From 20 yards away, it might have been a root cellar or a section of wall built to retain soil on the slope. In fact, it was a barn. She brought coal in on the first night of November when the temperature outside dropped to -8. The horse was skeptical in the way that horses are skeptical of new spaces, ears forward, nostrils working, one foot placed, and then reconsidered. But the interior was dark and still, and smelled of dried grass and stone, which are not threatening smells, and the floor had been packed clay topped with a layer of the driest upland grass she had kept for bedding. Cole stepped in, dropped his head, and pulled at the bedding. Marta sat on a low stone shelf she had built into the east wall. It was warm against the back of her legs, the warmth rising from the earth below, and she watched Cole settle. In the morning she did what she always did. She pressed her palm against the horse's flank and held it there. Warm. Not the fragile warmth of an animal that has been shivering through the night and has just now stopped. The settled, even warmth of a body that has not been working against the cold. A warmth that spoke of stillness, of air that had stayed where it had been put. She stood in that low doorway for a moment, looking out at the flat gray morning and the frost on the prairie that would not release for hours yet. Then she went inside and began laying the measurements for the second room. The grass was dry. The air was still. The wall was holding. It was the 3rd day of November, 1886, 40 days before the worst night of the worst winter in a generation, and Marta Solberg was already warm. There is a particular quality to the light on the northern plains in November that I have never been able to describe adequately, though I have tried several times in these letters and in the journal I kept during my years at Granger Flats. It is not darkness exactly. The sun still rises and sets on a reasonable schedule, but the quality of the light changes in a way that goes beyond angle or duration. It becomes, I think the word I want, is thin, as though the atmosphere itself has pulled back from something it senses coming, leaving the land exposed beneath a sky that has the color and warmth of old pewter. People who have lived through enough northern winters learn to read that light the way sailors read the color of water. It tells you things. Not with any precision. It will not tell you the date of the first hard freeze or the depth of the first significant snowfall, but it tells you, with a certainty that precedes thought, that the season has shifted its weight onto a different foot and what is coming is no longer theoretical. By the second week of November 1886, that light was everywhere over Granger Flats. Every person I visited on my rounds that week was moving with the particular urgency of people who feel time compressing. Woodpiles were being restacked and measured with anxious eyes. Barn walls were being patched with whatever material was available, rags, old canvas, strips of leather cut from worn-out harness. Men who had been putting off the harder maintenance work of summer and autumn were now doing it in cold they should have avoided, working stiff-fingered and rushed, which is exactly the wrong condition in which to do careful work. I noted all of this with the professional attentiveness that my years on the plains had developed in me. I noted also, with a precision I am not proud of, that I noted it and did nothing further. I was a physician. Barn insulation was not my domain. I told myself this and moved on to the next call. 6 miles west, Marta Solberg was building a second room. The first room, Cole's barn, had given her the proof she needed. The horse was warm, the walls were holding, the principle was sound. What the first room had also given her was a clearer understanding of where she had been imprecise in her thinking, and precision was something Marta took seriously in the way that people take seriously the things their fathers taught them to take seriously. Lars Bakken had built walls for 40 years, without a single structure failing from cold penetration. He had achieved this not through genius, but through the elimination of imprecision, one decision at a time, until the wall that remained had no weak points left to exploit. The first room had 3 weak points that Marta could identify. The door frame was the most significant. She had set it in the conventional manner, mortising the uprights into the threshold and lintel, and trusting the fit to be tight enough. It was not tight enough. On a still night, when she held a candle near the door frame, the flame moved in the lower left corner, pulling toward the gap with a steadiness that told her the cold was finding its way in, not dramatically, but persistently. The way water finds its way through stone, not by force, but by patience. She packed the gap with a mixture she had not used before. Clay worked wet until it had the consistency of bread dough, pressed into the crack in layers, and allowed to partially dry before the next layer was added. Mixed into the clay, she worked a quantity of dried grass cut fine, not the long bundled grass of the wall cavity, but grass chopped short with her hatchet until it was nearly dust, which she had read about somewhere, she told me, and half remembered and half reasoned out for herself. The short fiber kept the clay from cracking as it dried. When she tested the doorframe again with her candle, the flame held still. The second weak point was the window. She had made it too large, influenced by the instinct that a space meant for habitation needed light. But the first room was not for habitation. It was for an animal that needed warmth more than it needed daylight. She reduced the window opening by half, rebuilding the sill with stone and reseating the oiled hide she used as a pane. The cold that had been entering through the window's edges dropped to almost nothing. The third problem was more instructive than the other two because it was a problem she had not anticipated and would not have found in Bergstrom's work, which focused on structures meant to keep cold out rather than to hold animal warmth in. Coal generated heat. This was the point. The horse's body warmth, combined with the insulated walls, was sufficient to maintain a survivable temperature without any supplemental fire. But warmth rising from a large animal carries moisture. Breath, body heat, the slow evaporation from skin and manure, all of it added humidity to the closed air of the room, and humidity in a sealed space that is warmer than its surroundings will eventually find the coldest surface it can reach and condense there. The coldest surface in the first room was the ceiling, where the clay and gravel above were in closest contact with the frozen air outside. On the 8th morning after Cole moved in, Marta noticed a faint sheen on the underside of the roof poles. Not quite dripping, but the beginning of the process that would, if uncorrected, lead to rot in the timber and ice formation in the grass layer above it, which would compress the insulation and reduce its effectiveness precisely when it was needed most. She solved this the way her father would have solved it, with a gap. She opened 2 small apertures near the roof line, one on each end wall, each barely large enough to pass a fist through, angled upward through the packed earth above so that moist air could escape by convection without allowing significant cold to enter. The physics of this, as I understand it, rely on the fact that warm, moist air rises and will find its own exit if given one of sufficient size and position. The apertures were plugged loosely with bundled grass that could be removed in the coldest weather if ventilation was needed, and replaced if the cold coming through them became a problem. It was, as engineering solutions go, almost embarrassingly simple. It was also something I have never seen described in any building manual I have read before or since, and it worked. The second room went up faster than the first because she was no longer learning the materials. She knew how wet clay behaved and how dry clay behaved. She knew how to read the grass with her hands before she cut it. She knew the angles that shed water from the roof without allowing wind to get beneath the overhang. She worked in the order her father had taught her: foundation, then walls, then roof, then the details that sealed the transitions between them, because it is always the transitions, the places where one material meets another, where one plane becomes a different plane, that fail first. The second room was intended for the 4 cows and 2 goats. It was larger than the first and required a heavier roof beam, which she did not have. She spent 2 days solving this problem before she found the solution sitting in plain sight at the back of her barn. 3 lodgepole rails left over from fence work, each too short individually for the span she needed, which she lashed together with hemp rope at overlapping joints and braced with a vertical post at the midpoint. It was not elegant. A trained carpenter would have winced at it. But it distributed the load across 3 members instead of 1, which meant that the failure of any single rail would not bring the roof down. And it held a test load of her own body weight plus a considerable quantity of stacked stone without moving. She noted the solution in the way she noted most things, not by writing it down, but by standing in front of it for a moment with her head slightly tilted, committing its geometry to the same place she kept her father's words and Bergstrom's sketches, and the memory of the dry grass warm in her hands. Then she went back to work. By the last week of November, both rooms were complete and occupied. The 4 cows had required more persuasion than coal. Cattle are more conservative in their assessment of new spaces, and 3 of the 4 refused to enter on the first attempt and had to be led in individually on the second, with grain used as argument. Once inside, they settled with the philosophical acceptance that cattle bring to most situations they cannot change. The goats went in as though they had designed the space themselves. On the first morning after the animals were all in, Marta did the calculation she had been waiting to do. She counted the cordwood stacked against the east wall of her original homestead cabin, the small one-room structure she still slept in, and compared it against her estimate of what she would need for the coming winter. In previous years, she had burned approximately 1.5 quarts per month through the coldest 4 months, most of it going to the barn stove she ran at night to keep the livestock from suffering. Without that burden, her remaining wood supply represented not 4 months of fuel, but something closer to 7. She stood in front of the woodpile for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets. Then she went inside and made coffee. It was a small moment by any external measure. She did not write it down. She did not, as far as I know, tell anyone about it for several years. But I have thought about it often since she described it to me, because it seems to me to represent something important about the nature of practical wisdom, how it accumulates not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet mornings when a person stands in front of a woodpile and understands, without ceremony, that a problem has been solved. December arrived on the northern plains that year with a seriousness that got people's attention. The first snowfall came on the 3rd, a dry, fine-grained snow that the wind moved across the open prairie in low traveling sheets, filling the hollows and accumulating in the places where fences and buildings interrupted its path. By itself, it was not unusual. What was unusual was the cold that came with it, not the routine cold of early December, which most people in Granger Flats had learned to receive with the equanimity of long familiarity, but a deeper cold, one that felt settled and intentional, as though it had arrived planning to stay. I made my rounds that week with an extra layer under my coat for the first time since February. The thermometer outside Jonas Ridley's store read -14 on the morning of the 7th, which was the kind of temperature that typically arrived in January, not December. Ridley noted this with the careful neutrality of a man who does not want to alarm customers but cannot entirely conceal his own unease. "Early," he said, when I stopped to check the thermometer on my way through town. "Yes," I said. We stood there for a moment in the manner of men who have both had the same thought and have both decided not to say it. Inside the store, Reverend Houck was advising a young homesteader named Cutter to purchase an additional 100 pounds of salt pork and to reinforce his barn walls with whatever canvas he could spare from his wagon cover. The advice was sound, as far as it went. Salt pork would keep a family fed. Canvas over barn walls would reduce wind penetration modestly. What it would not do, as events would make clear, was enough. I visited Agnes Toll that same afternoon. She was teaching the older children long division and the younger ones their letters, moving between the two groups with the efficient economy of a woman who has learned to do 2 things adequately rather than 1 thing well. Clara sat in her corner with her rag doll and a blanket pulled around her shoulders, which told me the room temperature without needing to look for a thermometer. I pressed my palm against the interior wall. It was cold enough that I kept my hand there for only a few seconds. "How is your fuel supply?" I asked Agnes. "Sufficient," she said, which was what capable women in difficult circumstances said when they meant, "I don't know, and I am not going to think about it yet." I looked at the wall again. Then I looked at Clara. Then I made the decision I had been declining to make for 2 months, which was to involve myself in something that was not strictly medical. "There is a woman named Marta Solberg," I said, "who has built something 6 miles west of here that I think you should know about." Agnes looked at me with the expression of a person who is listening but reserving judgment. "The Norwegian widow?" "Yes." "I have heard she is doing something peculiar with her barn walls." "She is," I said. "But I think peculiar may be the wrong word for it." I did not even then fully understand what Marta had built. I had not yet been inside the structure. I knew only what I had heard secondhand through Helga Brandt, who had visited in late November and had come back with the slightly dazed expression of a practical person who has seen something that has rearranged her assumptions. But I knew enough to know that Agnes Toll's walls were inadequate, and I knew that the winter bearing down on Granger Flats was not going to be argued with by canvas and salt pork alone. Agnes listened. She nodded. She did not say she would visit. 2 weeks later, I would understand what that nod had and had not meant. Outside, the pewter sky had deepened towards something darker. The wind was moving the snow in long, unbroken lines across the frozen ground, and the temperature, when I stepped out of the schoolhouse and drew breath, carried the specific quality that experienced plainsmen described as the cold behind the cold, the signal that what had arrived was not the leading edge of the season, but its full weight, finally committed. I pulled my coat tighter and went to find my horse. To the west, visible from the edge of town on clear days as a low, dark line against the pale horizon, the ridgeline stood unchanged. The snow accumulated on its north face and was scoured from its south face by the same wind it had been redirecting for 10,000 years. At its base, in the 2 rooms that Marta had finished 3 weeks before, 8 animals stood in the still air, warm in the manner of creatures whose warmth has never been in question. The worst of the winter had not yet arrived, but it was very close now, and it was paying attention. The 12th of January, 1887, was a Monday. I know this because I have the journal entry, written that evening in handwriting that is somewhat less steady than my usual, which I attribute partly to the cold and partly to the state of mind I was in when I finally sat down to write it. The entry reads, in its entirety, -41 degrees at Ridley's thermometer, 6 p.m. Toll household, see notes. Solberg structure confirmed. Will write more when I am warmer and less ashamed of myself. I never wrote the longer entry. 34 years later, I am writing it now. The blizzard had begun 4 days earlier, on the 8th, which was itself the culmination of a week of temperatures that had not risen above -20 during the daylight hours. By the 10th, the town had the appearance and the atmosphere of a place conducting a siege defense. People moved between buildings only when necessary and only by the most direct routes, bent forward into wind that had been blowing from the northwest for so many consecutive days that it had ceased to seem like weather and had begun to seem like a permanent condition of existence. I had been making my rounds each day, though the rounds had contracted considerably from their usual scope. I visited the families I was most concerned about, the elderly, the households with young children, the homesteads where I knew the construction was poorest and the fuel supplies most likely to have been optimistic in their original estimation. I moved quickly, and I did not stay long, because staying long meant asking hospitality of people who had little enough for themselves, and because I had learned by that point in my career that a physician who collapses from exposure is useful to no one. On the morning of the 12th, I visited 7 households. The Cutter family, who had followed Houck's advice and purchased the additional salt pork, were cold but stable. The elderly Magnuson couple, who had been burning their kitchen chairs since the 9th, were in more genuine difficulty, and I spent an hour arranging for Jonas Ridley to deliver a quarter cord from the store's emergency reserve, which he did with a minimum of complaint and a maximum of the expression of a man who was doing the right thing at considerable personal cost. The other 5 households were managing, in the way that people manage things when managing is the only option available. I had intended to visit Agnes Toll in the morning. I did not reach her until evening. This was not negligence, or not entirely. There was a child at the Halverson homestead with the early signs of frostbite on 2 toes, which required attention and then required that I stay long enough to instruct the mother in what to watch for, and then required that I sit for a moment by their stove and restore enough sensation to my own hands to safely manage a pen. By the time I left the Halverson place, the afternoon light, such as it was, thin and gray and entirely theoretical, had given way to the particular darkness of a plains blizzard, which is unlike nighttime darkness in that it is not simply an absence of light, but an active, textured thing, full of moving particles that catch whatever light remains and scatter it uselessly in all directions. I drove toward the schoolhouse by feel and by the knowledge of the road that 6 years had put into my hands and my horse's memory. I saw the problem from 30 yards out. There was no light in the window. This requires a word of explanation. Agnes Toll, whatever her circumstances, kept a lamp burning in the schoolhouse window from before dark until she went to sleep. She had told me once that she did this partly from habit and partly because the lamp was visible from several homesteads to the north and east, and its presence in the window each evening was a signal to those households that the school teacher and her daughter were well. The lamp's absence was not a signal she had ever intentionally sent. I stopped the buggy and sat for a moment looking at the dark window. Then I got down and went to the door. The room inside was colder than the night. This is not hyperbole. When I opened the door, the air that met my face was the air of a space that had been losing heat steadily for hours, denser and more completely cold than the open air outside, which at least had the character of movement. The lamp on the table had burned out. The stove was cold iron. On the floor in the corner, Agnes was sitting with her back against the wall and Clara in her lap, both of them wrapped in everything Agnes had been able to pull from the trunk beside the bed. Clara was asleep or something adjacent to sleep. Agnes looked up at me with an expression that I have thought about many times since, not relief exactly and not fear, but the expression of a person who has been holding a great deal of weight for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. "The fuel ran out this afternoon," she said. Her voice was steady, which concerned me more than unsteadiness would have. I did not want to take Clara into the storm. I checked Clara first. Her extremities were cold but responsive. Her color was poor, but not the specific color I had learned to fear. She was in the early stages of what would become serious if it continued. But she was not yet past the point where warmth and time would be sufficient. "We are going to Marta Solberg's," I said. Agnes looked at me. Outside, the wind made the sound it had been making for 4 days. Not a howl exactly, but a sustained, indifferent pressure, like something very large leaning against the walls. 6 miles, she said. "My horse knows the road." She did not argue. She gathered Clara against her chest and stood, and I wrapped my own coat around both of them, and we went out into the dark. I will not dwell on the drive because the drive was not the story. It was 40 minutes of cold and wind, and the particular concentration required to keep a horse moving in a direction it would have preferred not to go. My hands lost feeling somewhere around the 2nd mile and recovered something approximate to it around the 5th, which is not a medical outcome I would recommend. What I will dwell on is the moment I pulled the buggy up to the low south-facing wall of Marta's structure and helped Agnes and Clara down from the seat and knocked on the timber-framed door, and it opened. The warmth did not rush out at me. That is the first thing I noticed, and it is the thing I have thought about most carefully in the years since, because it taught me something about the nature of what Marta had built. In a conventional heated space, a room with a stove, a cabin with a good fire, warmth escapes through an open door immediately, pouring out in a visible breath of condensation, reminding you of its source and its expendability. The warmth inside Marta's structure did not do this. It was not warmth that was being generated and therefore could be depleted. It was warmth that was being retained, held in the still air between the walls the way water is held in a clay vessel, not produced, but preserved. I stepped across the threshold and stood in 51 degrees Fahrenheit, while the thermometer I had checked 2 hours earlier at Ridley's store had read -41. Marta stood in the doorway to the inner room holding a lantern. She looked at Agnes and Clara without surprise, in the manner of a person who has been expecting the thing that has arrived, though perhaps not tonight in particular. She stepped aside. She did not speak until she had settled Clara onto the stone shelf built into the east wall, warm against the child's legs, the earth below still holding what the autumn had given it, and until she had set a pot of water on the small clay stove she kept in the corner, the only fire in the space, burning a quantity of wood that struck me, when I thought about it later, as almost insultingly modest. "Sit," she said to Agnes. Agnes sat. She was shaking now, which was the appropriate response, and a better one than the stillness that had worried me in the schoolhouse. The body remembers what it is owed. I stood in the middle of the room and did what I should have done 2 months earlier, when Marta had asked me about soil thermal properties, and I had answered her and moved on. I looked at the walls. They were thick, far thicker than the conventional single-course construction of every other building in Granger Flats. Where the lantern light caught the face of the stone, I could see the careful fitting of the courses, the clay packed cleanly into the joints. The doorframe showed the slightly different color of the secondary clay layer she had applied to seal the gaps. At the roofline, barely visible in the shadow, the 2 small ventilation apertures she had cut for moisture management. And behind all of it, doing its invisible and essential work, the grass. The dried upland prairie grass, cut at the right time and packed at the right density, and chosen with the specific knowledge that dry grass is not simply dry grass, but is, in the right conditions, a matrix of hollow stems holding still air in quantity sufficient to change the thermal character of an entire wall. I pressed my palm against the inner face of the north wall and held it there for a slow count of 30. The wall was not warm, but it was not cold in the way that cold surfaces are cold, not extracting heat from my hand, not making demands. It was simply inert, neutral, holding its position between the inside and the outside without surrendering to either. I thought of Lars Becken, whom I had never met, packing a neighbor's barn wall on a hillside outside Bergen, while his 10-year-old daughter watched and remembered. "How long have you known this would work?" I asked. Marta handed Agnes a cup and looked at me with the expression she used when a question was less precise than she preferred. "I knew the principle worked," she said. "I did not know the walls would work until they did. And if they hadn't?" She considered this with genuine seriousness, which was her way. "Then I would have found what was wrong and corrected it." From behind the inner wall came the sound of animals in the dark, the slow movement of cattle shifting their weight, the lower register of Cole's breathing, the occasional small sound of the goats, which are never entirely silent. Life going about its business in the warm dark, indifferent to the record cold, pressing against the outside of a wall packed with dry grass and still air. Clara had fallen properly asleep on the stone shelf. Agnes sat with her cup in both hands and looked at the walls with the expression I recognized from Helga Brandt's face 6 weeks earlier. Not wonder exactly, but the specific recalibration of a capable person who has just learned that their model of what is possible was missing a variable. "Who taught you this?" Agnes asked. "My father," Marta said, "and 6 years of watching a man who thought out loud." "Could you teach it to others?" Marta looked at her for a moment. "I already am," she said. By the time the spring came that year, late, reluctant, arriving in fits of warmth that retreated before they fully committed, the counting had begun. I did the counting myself because I had decided in January that if I was going to understand what had happened in this valley, I was going to gather the numbers with my own hands rather than wait for someone else to report them. I visited every household within 8 miles of Granger Flats that April, and I recorded livestock survival rates in the same journal where I had written -41 on the 12th of January. The valley average was not good. Across the 31 households that had wintered in place, approximately 60% of cattle and 40% of smaller livestock had been lost. These were numbers consistent with the reports coming in from across the territory. The Great Die-Up had been as bad as its name suggested, and there were ranchers from Montana to Nebraska who would not recover from it. The households within a mile of the ridgeline told a different story. Marta had lost nothing. Helga Brandt, who had begun reinforcing her own barn walls in late November using what Marta had shown her, had lost 2 animals, both to illness unrelated to cold, both in December before the reinforcement was complete. The Cotter family, who had borrowed Helga's labor and Marta's instructions for 2 weeks in early December, had lost 15% of their herd, which was a hard winter's loss, but not a catastrophic one. I wrote these numbers down with the particular care I use when writing things I intend to remember. When I showed them to Reverend Houck, he looked at them for a long moment and then said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, "I preached 3 sermons in November about the virtue of conventional preparation." "You did," I said. "I did not mention Mrs. Solberg's walls." "No." He handed me back the journal. He was not a man who apologized easily, but he was, at his core, a man who believed in evidence, which is more than can be said for everyone. "I will call on her," he said. He did. He spent an afternoon at the Ridgeline in April, listening to Marta explain the principle and the construction in the same unhurried way she explained everything, not as instruction exactly, but as description, as though she were simply telling you what was true and trusting you to understand its application yourself. He came back to town and preached the following Sunday about the particular form of reverence that consists of paying close attention to the world as it actually is. It was, by his standards, an excellent sermon. I told him so. He seemed pleased in the way that ministers are pleased when their message lands, with relief more than satisfaction. Agnes Toll wrote up what she had learned that spring in 4 handwritten pages that she titled, with the precision of a woman who had spent years teaching children to be exact about language, on the thermal properties of double-wall construction for prairie dwellings, with notes on materials and method. She gave a copy to Jonas Ridley, who had a small hand press in the back room he used for printing notices, and he ran off 11 copies, which Agnes distributed personally to the households she considered most at risk for the following winter. Helga Brandt sent her copy to her sister in the German settlement south of the valley, with a covering letter in German that explained the principle more plainly than Agnes's formal prose. Her sister shared it. By the following autumn, Marta had been visited by 14 families from 3 different settlements, each of them asking the same questions in different accents. She answered them all the same way, by taking them to the wall and letting them press their own palms against it. In Fargo, in December of 1921, I set down my pen and look at what I have written. The fire in my stove has burned low while I have been at this letter, and the room has taken on a chill that I notice in my hands before I notice it anywhere else. The hands go first, always, in this climate. I should add wood. I will in a moment. But first I want to sit here for a moment in the cooling room and think about Marta Solberg, who is 79 years old, and still, by the last account I had of her, living at the Ridgeline property. The structure she built in 1886 has been expanded and modified several times over the decades by her own account and by the accounts of people who have visited her there. The principle has not changed. I think about what it means that a German engineering journal published in 1920 is describing, in formal technical language, a principle that a Norwegian wall builder's daughter applied in Dakota Territory 34 years earlier, working from memory and intuition and the specific knowledge that dry grass is warm in the hand when you press it. I think about Agnes Toll's daughter Clara, who is now 39 years old and teaches school in Bismarck, and who I am told insists on inspecting the wall construction of any building where children will spend the winter before she agrees to conduct classes in it. I think this is an excellent habit, and I have told her so in correspondence. I think about Cole, who died in the winter of 1893 at an age that Marta estimated at 21 years, which is a considerable age for a horse, particularly one that had spent 7 winters in a well-insulated earthen barn. And I think about what I told myself in the autumn of 1886 when Marta asked me about soil thermal properties, and I answered her and wrote nothing down and moved on. I told myself that barn insulation was not my domain. It was a true statement that arrived at a false conclusion, which is one of the more common ways that intelligent people fail to act on what is in front of them. You are starting your medical career, Edmund, in a world that knows a great deal more than the world I started in. You have instruments I did not have. You have colleagues I could not have imagined. You have access to a literature of medicine that would have seemed miraculous to me in 1883, sitting in a sod house with a lantern and a copy of Gray's Anatomy. None of this will help you if you move on too quickly from the question you do not immediately recognize as important. The most useful thing I learned in 18 years of practice on the Northern Plains was not a surgical technique or a diagnostic method. It was this. When a careful, quiet person asks you a question that seems to fall outside your domain, stop moving. Stay with the question. Find out why they are asking it. They may know something that has no name yet. Marta Solberg knew it in 1886. The German engineers found the language for it in 1920. Somewhere between those two dates, a great many walls could have been thicker. Add wood to your stove, Edmund, when it needs it. And pay attention to the people who are pressing their palms against the walls and thinking. Your uncle, August Fenner, M.D. Fargo, North Dakota, December 11, 1921.